You've been feeling it for months now. This growing distance between you and the people you used to feel closest to. Not because anyone did anything wrong. Not because there was some falling out or betrayal. Just this slow, quiet drifting where you're changing and they're staying the same, and suddenly the conversations that used to flow easily feel forced. The jokes don't land the same way. The topics that used to fill hours now feel hollow. And you're left with this uncomfortable truth. You're becoming a better version of yourself, and that version doesn't fit into your old life anymore. And nobody prepared you for how lonely that would feel. How isolating it is to outgrow people you care about. How guilt-inducing it is to realize that your growth is creating distance. How confusing it is to simultaneously feel proud of who you're becoming and devastated by who you're losing in the process. Because growth was supposed to make things better. You were supposed to improve your life, become healthier, more capable, more aligned with your values. And you have. You've done all of that. But nobody mentioned that sometimes becoming better means becoming alone. That elevation comes with separation. That the person you're meant to be might not be compatible with the life you built when you were someone else. This really hit me about 9 months ago. I'd been working on myself pretty intentionally. Going to therapy, reading, actually implementing the things I was learning instead of just consuming them. And I was changing. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The way I thought about things was different. The way I responded to situations was different. The patterns I used to participate in started feeling uncomfortable instead of familiar. And I noticed it first with my closest friend group. We'd been tight for years. Had all these inside jokes and shared history. Spent most weekends together doing the same kinds of things. And it had been comfortable. Easy. The kind of friendship where you don't have to think about it, you just show up and it works. But after months of intentional growth, something shifted. I remember this particular Friday night. We were all at someone's apartment, doing our usual thing. Drinking, talking, playing the same games, having the same types of conversations we'd been having for years. And I was there physically, but mentally I was somewhere else. They were complaining about the same things they'd been complaining about for months. The same job frustrations, the same relationship problems, the same life circumstances. And instead of joining in like I usually did, I just felt this distance. This awareness that we'd had these exact conversations before and nothing had changed. That we were going in circles. That everyone seemed content to vent without actually changing anything. And I tried to participate. Tried to be present. But everything I wanted to say felt out of place. I'd been learning about taking responsibility instead of playing victim. About changing what you can control instead of just complaining about what you can't. About growth and discomfort and intentional change. And none of that fit into the conversation we were having. So I stayed quiet mostly. Smiled and nodded and laughed at the appropriate times. But inside I was feeling this growing distance. This realization that I wasn't the same person who used to enjoy these nights. That I'd changed in ways that made this dynamic uncomfortable instead of comforting. I left early, made some excuse about being tired. And I drove home feeling this heavy sadness. Because I loved these people. They were my people. But I wasn't sure I was their people anymore. I wasn't sure we were operating on the same frequency anymore. And I didn't know what to do with that realization. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing it everywhere. In conversations that used to energize me that now felt draining. In activities that used to be fun that now felt empty. In relationships where I was playing a version of myself I'd outgrown just to keep things comfortable for everyone else. And the loneliness of that was profound. Because I was around people constantly. I wasn't physically isolated. But I felt more alone than I'd felt in years. Because real loneliness isn't about being by yourself. It's about being with people and realizing they can't meet you where you are. That the version of you that fits into their lives isn't the version you're becoming. I started making different choices. Saying no to things I would have automatically said yes to before. Spending more time alone working on myself instead of maintaining relationships that felt increasingly hollow. Setting boundaries that created discomfort. And every choice that moved me closer to the person I wanted to be moved me further from the social life I'd had. And people noticed. Friends would comment that I'd changed, that I wasn't as fun as I used to be, that I'd gotten too serious, that I was becoming different in ways they didn't understand. And they weren't wrong. I had changed. I was different. But their observation felt like criticism, like I was supposed to stay the same to make them comfortable, like growth was only acceptable if it didn't disrupt the dynamic. I tried to explain it once, tried to articulate that I was working on myself, that I was trying to become better, that the changes they were seeing were positive even if they didn't feel positive to them. But it came out defensive, made it sound like I thought I was better than them, made it seem like I was judging their choices instead of just making different ones for myself. So I stopped explaining, stopped trying to make them understand, just quietly continued on my path while the distance grew. And it was painful. Mourning friendships that weren't dead but weren't alive in the way they used to be. Grieving the loss of belonging while simultaneously feeling grateful for the growth that was causing the loss. I'd have these moments late at night where I'd question everything. Wonder if I was making a mistake. If personal growth was worth this loneliness. If becoming better was supposed to feel this isolating. If maybe I should just go back to who I was, even if that version felt like a costume now, just to have the comfort of belonging again. But I couldn't go back. That's what I learned. Once you start really changing, once you start seeing things differently, you can't unsee them. You can't unfeel the discomfort of old patterns. You can't unknow what you've learned about yourself and what you need. You can only move forward even when moving forward means moving alone. Maybe you're feeling this too. Maybe you've been working on yourself and noticing that the more you grow, the less you fit into your old life. Maybe you're standing in rooms full of people you've known for years and feeling completely alone because nobody can meet you where you are now. Maybe you're grieving relationships that haven't ended but have fundamentally changed because you've fundamentally changed. Here's what nobody tells you about personal growth. They don't tell you that it's lonely. That becoming better often means becoming isolated. That elevation requires separation. That the path to being your authentic self runs through a period of not belonging anywhere. We're sold this story where personal growth makes everything better. Where working on yourself improves your relationships, expands your opportunities, creates this upgraded version of your life. And in the long term that might be true. But in the short term? In the immediate aftermath of real change? It often just makes you lonely. Because you're not the same person anymore. The things that used to satisfy you don't anymore. The conversations that used to engage you feel surface level. The relationships that used to feel deep feel shallow. The activities that used to fill your time feel like time wasting. You've changed the frequency you operate on, and suddenly you're out of sync with everyone around you. And the hardest part is that you can't blame anyone. Your friends didn't do anything wrong. They're the same people they've always been. The same people you chose and loved and built history with. They haven't changed. You have. And now you're the one creating distance. You're the one who doesn't fit anymore. You're the one who's disrupting the dynamic. So you're left with this guilt on top of the loneliness. Guilt that your growth is hurting people you care about. Guilt that you can't just be who you were to make things easier. Guilt that you're choosing yourself over maintaining relationships. Guilt that feels heavy even though logically you know you're making the right choices. And people don't understand why you can't just participate in both. Why you can't do your growth work and also maintain your old relationships exactly as they were. Why you can't be both versions of yourself depending on the context. They think you're being rigid. That you're making it harder than it needs to be. That you're choosing isolation when you could choose connection. But they don't understand that being both versions is exhausting. That code switching between who you're becoming and who you used to be takes energy you don't have. That pretending you haven't changed just to keep everyone comfortable is its own kind of isolation. That being surrounded by people while hiding your real self is lonelier than being actually alone. So you start spending more time alone. Not because you want to be alone, but but because alone feels more honest than surrounded by people you can't be authentic with. Because solitude feels less lonely than connection that requires you to perform a version of yourself you've outgrown. And that choice, that decision to be alone rather than fake connection, that's when the real loneliness hits. Because humans aren't meant to be alone. We need community, connection, belonging. And you're actively choosing to be without those things because the alternative, belonging at the cost of authenticity, feels worse than loneliness. But it doesn't feel worse all the time. Some days it does feel worse. Some days you'd trade growth for belonging in a heartbeat. Some days you question whether becoming better is worth losing everyone who knew you before. Some days you wonder if maybe you're the problem. Maybe you're being too rigid, too judgmental, too unwilling to meet people where they are. And maybe there's truth in that. Maybe growth doesn't require complete isolation. Maybe you could maintain some relationships while changing. Maybe the all-or-nothing approach isn't the only option. But when you're in the middle of fundamental change, when you're rebuilding yourself from the ground up, sometimes the only way to protect that process is to create space from everything that reinforces who you used to be. The loneliness isn't forever. That's what you have to keep telling yourself. This is a transition period. A phase of separation that's necessary for integration. You're becoming someone new, and that person needs space to fully form before they can authentically connect with others. The isolation is temporary, even though it feels permanent when you're in it. But knowing it's temporary doesn't make it easier. Doesn't fill the Friday nights that used to be full of people. Doesn't replace the texts that used to come constantly. Doesn't resolve the ache of missing people who are still alive but who you can't connect with anymore because you're not the person they knew. So about 4 months into this lonely growth phase, something unexpected happened. One of my friends from that core group reached out. Not the group text, not the casual check-in. A real, intentional reach out saying we needed to talk. And I was nervous. I assumed they were going to confront me about pulling away. Tell me I'd been acting different. Ask what was wrong. Give me the speech about how friendship requires effort and I hadn't been making any. But that's not what happened. They told me they'd been watching me change over the past months. And that watching me had made them realize they were stuck. That they'd been complaining about the same things for years without changing them. That they'd been going through the motions instead of actually living. That seeing me do the hard work of actually changing had held up a mirror to their own stagnation. And they weren't mad at me for it. They were grateful. They said my distance had actually been a catalyst. That my unwillingness to keep participating in the same cycles had forced them to look at those cycles differently. That my growth, as lonely as it was making me, was inspiring them to start their own. I just sat there, completely caught off guard. Because I'd been carrying so much guilt about pulling away. So much shame about not being able to maintain those relationships while changing. So much pain about the loneliness my growth was causing. And here was someone telling me that my lonely growth had actually been valuable to them. We talked for hours. About the work I'd been doing. About what they were starting to recognize in themselves. About how hard it is to change. About how isolating growth can be. And for the first time in months I felt seen. Not by someone who knew the old me, but by someone who was starting to understand the new me. And they said something that completely reframed everything. They said that my loneliness hadn't been the cost of growth. It had been the filter. That by becoming someone who couldn't participate in those old patterns, I'd naturally filtered for people who were ready for something different. That the friends who'd felt distant weren't wrong or bad, they just weren't on the same path. And the ones who were on a similar path would eventually find me because we'd be operating on the same frequency. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing this was true. I'd been so focused on who I was losing that I hadn't noticed who I was finding. The people I was meeting in therapy groups, in classes I was taking, in spaces oriented toward growth. These weren't people from my past trying to adjust to my changes. These were people who already operated at the frequency I was reaching for. And the connection with them was different. Deeper in some ways. Less comfortable but more real. Less based on shared history and more based on shared values and direction. It wasn't replacing the old friendships. It was creating something new. Something that fit who I was becoming instead of who I'd been. And I realized something that shifted everything. The loneliness I'd been feeling wasn't actually isolation. It was space. Space between who I'd been and who I was becoming. Space necessary for the new version to fully form. Space that felt empty but was actually full of potential for new connections that would be more aligned with my authentic self. The old friendships weren't wrong. They just reflected an earlier version of me. And I wasn't wrong for outgrowing them. I was just changing. And change always creates distance before it creates new connection. The loneliness was the gap, the transition, the necessary separation before new integration. And some of those old friends would make the journey with me, like the one who reached out. Some would start their own growth and we'd reconnect at a different level. But some wouldn't. And that was okay. It was sad, but it was okay. Because staying connected to them at the cost of my own growth would have been sadder. Would have been choosing their comfort over my authenticity. Would have been betraying myself to maintain belonging. So if you're in this space right now, if you're becoming better and lonelier at the same time, if you're grieving relationships while celebrating growth, I need you to hear this. The loneliness is real. The loss is real. The grief is valid. But it's also temporary. It's also necessary. It's also part of the process of becoming who you're meant to be. You're not doing it wrong. You're not being too rigid or too judgmental or too unwilling to compromise. You're just changing. And change creates distance. And distance feels lonely. But lonely growth is still growth. And growth that feels lonely now will eventually lead to connection that feels authentic. The people you're losing aren't bad people. The relationships you're outgrowing weren't wrong. They were right for who you were. They're just not right for who you're becoming. And that's not a failure of those relationships. That's just evolution. That's just the natural consequence of growth. You don't have to feel guilty about it. You don't have to apologize for changing. You don't have to shrink yourself back down to fit into spaces that no longer fit you. You can let the distance happen. You can grieve it while also knowing it's necessary. You can be sad about what you're losing while being excited about who you're becoming. Write me a comment about what you've lost in your growth. Not to be dramatic about it, just to be honest. What friendships have changed? What relationships feel different? What parts of your old life don't fit anymore? Tell me what you're grieving while you're growing. And hit that like button if you felt lonely while getting better. If you've noticed that the more you work on yourself, the less you fit into your old life. If you've experienced the isolation that comes with elevation. Let's acknowledge that growth isn't just positive. That it comes with real losses. That becoming better sometimes means becoming alone, at least for a while. Tell me in the comments about a time when your growth created distance in a relationship. Or tell me about new connections you've made that fit the new version of you. Tell me about people you've found at the frequency you're reaching for. Tell me it gets less lonely eventually. Because I think we need to talk more honestly about this. About how personal growth isn't just all positive. About how becoming better can make you lonelier. About how the path to your authentic self often runs through a period of not belonging. About how that's normal and necessary and doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Let's build a space here where we can admit that we're lonely. Where we can grieve the relationships that aren't working anymore. Where we can acknowledge that we miss who we used to be sometimes, even though we can't go back. Where we can be honest about how hard it is to grow when growth means losing connection. And if you know someone who's been pulling away, someone who's been changing in ways that create distance, someone who seems to be choosing growth over maintaining relationships, send this to them. Not as an excuse for them abandoning you, but as an explanation for what might be happening. As a reminder that their distance isn't necessarily rejection. That their growth isn't necessarily judgment. That sometimes people need space to become who they're meant to be. Maybe the loneliness is the price. Maybe becoming better means becoming alone for a while. Maybe that's just part of the deal. But maybe it's worth it. Maybe authentic solitude is better than inauthentic connection. Maybe lonely growth leads to aligned connection eventually. Maybe the space you're creating now is making room for the relationships that will actually fit the person you're becoming. Keep growing. Keep changing. Keep becoming who you're meant to be, even when it means losing who you were and who knew you then. Not because it's easy. Not because it doesn't hurt. But because you deserve to be your authentic self. Because you deserve relationships that meet you where you actually are. Because you deserve to build a life that fits who you are now, not who you used to be. The loneliness is temporary. The growth is permanent. And one day you'll look around and realize you're not lonely anymore. You're just surrounded by different people. People who get you at this level. People who operate on this frequency. People who don't require you to shrink to belong. And that belonging, that authentic connection with your authentic self, that's worth every lonely night of becoming. You're not alone in being lonely. You're not the only one who's becoming better and more isolated at the same time. You're not wrong for choosing growth over comfortable stagnation. You're just in transition. Just in the gap between who you were and who you're becoming. Just in the necessary separation before new integration. And it's hard. But it's worth it. Even when it doesn't feel worth it. Especially then. That's when it's most true.